Thank you all for joining the Stanford Political Union tonight for our winter quarter speaker event on the rise of populism. My name is Lauren. I'm a member of the events team for the Stanford Political Union. For those of you here for the first time, the Stanford Political Union, or SPU, is a nonpartisan organization dedicated to fostering constructive dialogue on campus. Founded in 1938, we provide a forum for meaningful discussions about pressing issues between students and speakers with diverse perspectives, viewpoints, and experiences. In these divided times, we believe it is not only possible but necessary for Stanford students to speak with those who hold views they may disagree with or even detest. We therefore strive to create a pluralistic hub for dialogue and civic engagement on campus through our community discussions, intercollegiate conferences, and speaker events like this one. Now I'll hand it over to Eli, a member of our events committee, who will introduce our guest speaker and moderate today's discussion.
Thanks for coming, everybody. Anna GB is the Michelle and Kevin Douglas Professor of International Studies in the Department of Political Science. She also serves as the director of the Europe Center and is a senior fellow at the Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies. Her research focuses on the historical development and transformation of the state, political parties, religion and politics, and post-communist political systems. She's the author of influential books, including Redeeming the Communist Past, Rebuilding Leviathan, Nations Under God, and Sacred Foundations. Through her scholarship, she's made significant contributions to understanding how institutions evolve, the role of religion and political outcomes, and the enduring legacy of historical structures in contemporary politics. She's been a recipient of both the Carnegie and Guggenheim Fellowships, and her work continues to shape debates on democracy, populism, and the resilience of state institutions in the face of political challenges worldwide. We're extremely lucky to have her today, and I'll hand it off to her for her presentation.
Great. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. I'm delighted to be here. Thank you for a very kind introduction and for the invitation. Thank you, those of you who brought your parents. It's good to have someone roughly my age. It's delightful. So in this talk today, I'll really try to make 3 points. And this is about sort of, the populism and the global erosion of democracy, about its international diffusion, and about the kind of domestic constraints that we might see on this erosion of democracy that is otherwise so troubling. So the first thing to point out is that this is a global phenomenon. Populists are taking over power everywhere, and they're eroding democracy once in office almost everywhere. So here we have this rogues gallery of Alexander Vučić of Serbia, Viktor Orbán of Hungary, Narendra Modi in India, and Benjamin Netanyahu in Israel. And of course, there are also cases in Latin America, like Chavez in Venezuela and AMLO in Mexico, Marcos in the Philippines, and Duterte, as well as Shinawatra in Thailand. So this is very much a global phenomenon. And all of these populists make two claims. This is kind of what distinguishes them from other kinds of politicians. The first claim is that the establishment basically consists of these corrupt, unresponsive, and unaccountable elites. And by this, they mean everyone from the media to politicians to university professors, et cetera, et cetera. The point is that they basically view the elites as this undifferentiated cartel that doesn't serve people's interests. And so they are also very skeptical about the kind of institutions, the kind of political institutions that they think these elites have created. And that ranges, as we'll see, from everything from the media to courts to the free press. Secondly, the second claim that all these populists make is that the people have to be represented. That given this lack of accountability and responsiveness by the mainstream elites, we need to better represent the people as such. But of course, before you represent the people, you have to define them first. And a lot of these populists narrowly define the people, basically excluding immigrants, religious minorities, ethnic minorities, sexual minorities, and so on, in a very narrow and exclusive definition of the people itself. Now, these are not your parents' dictators, right? So these are not totalitarian regimes that demand full loyalty. You don't have mass violence in the streets and people being rounded up and carted off to jail. Indeed, what we see instead is relatively little coercion, or at least relatively little open coercion. If you squint, people look like they're totally free. Elections continue to be held. It's just that the playing field has been tilted. You still see some free media and some criticism, although overwhelmingly the media and the press basically bend the knee. And citizens are still allowed to speak out so long as they don't organize too effectively. But the playing field is tilted. And so it's overwhelmingly likely that the populists get reelected time and time again into office. And the institutions are politicized. So because the political institutions are seen as sort of, these creatures of this corrupt cartel, what we see a lot of times is that when populists come to power, they politicize these institutions and basically suborn them and make them into effective political tools. What we don't see are military coups or violent takeovers. When populists come to power, they come to power through elections. And a lot of that has to do, this changing dynamic of how illiberal elites come to power has to do with the Cold War. If we look at the pattern by which democracies erode, during the Cold War, it's overwhelmingly military coups and even revolutions. After the end of the Cold War in 1990, after the Soviet Union and the United States stopped waging these wars by proxy, basically the number of coups per year drops by half, and the ones that are held are much less effective. And so would-be autocrats after the end of the Cold War are left on their own. They have to basically take over power themselves. And so instead of this kind of violent coercion, military coups, or revolutions, what we see instead are basically populists who come to power through elections. Here's one exemplar, Viktor Orbán, looking characteristically jaundiced. He comes to power in 2010 and then gets reelected in 2014, 2018, 2022, and there's, of course, every likelihood that he'll get elected again next year. So they come to power via elections, and they continue to hold these elections, even though they're overwhelmingly likely to win them. What we don't see is a revolutionary implosion of institutions, but instead the modal pattern has been of a gradual erosion of democratic institutions, kind of a chiseling away, a chipping away. The Supreme Court has term limits placed on it. A few journalists might be told to leave their positions. The government takes over a few free media institutions. But it's all gradual, which means that a lot of times people don't notice what's happening until it's too late. And the goal of this is basically to have a permanent incumbency, that people like Viktor Orbán can continue to be in office time and time again, but their countries look like they're democracies, which gives them international legitimacy and kind of mutes the criticism that they face. And the result in many of these cases is something called competitive authoritarianism, which is basically an autocratic regime where one party or one set of politicians always governs, but it looks competitive. There's still an opposition. There's still the trappings of democracy. And if we look at even some of the most established democracies in the world, these rich democracies in Europe, these parties are gaining. So this is a graph that shows us the post-communist democracies, where these parties from the get-go, from the first time that elections are held in the 1990s, are very popular and their popularity continues to increase. But it's also the case in these developed democracies, in places like France, Germany, Italy, and Spain, where illiberal populists have been steadily gaining votes starting in the 1990s. And it looks like in next week's elections, the illiberal populist party, the AfD, might be poised to take as much as 20% of the vote, which in a multi-party system is enormous. And the thing is that once they get into office, we really need to take them seriously and literally. Because once they're in office, they tend to erode the formal institutions of democracy, and they also pose an informal threat to democratic norms and values. And the template here is remarkably similar. We see the same template being implemented over and over again in various countries. So the first point of attack are institutions of accountability and oversight. The first target are usually the courts, because the courts are this powerful, autonomous guardrail. They're a constraint on what politicians can do. There's also attacks on civil society, on the ability of people to organize and to oppose the regime, and on the media, as yet another way in which governments can be held accountable. These parties then, to build support, basically give out all kinds of goodies, but only to their own supporters. So this can take the form of clientelistic politics. It can take the form of targeting aid to areas that are particularly supportive of the governing regime, or to simply handing out contracts and tenders to the cronies of the regime itself. A lot of times they will attack education and science. In Hungary, for example, all the universities were suborned, and the one independent university was effectively kicked out of the country. And they also attack science as well as being sort of, again, this kind of exemplar of independence and independent thinking. They tend to engage in a lot of misinformation. And in an ideal setting, they control the media. They basically have the media, which in many countries has a government component to it, become the mouthpieces, the propaganda mouthpieces of the government. And if they're really lucky, if they get a supermajority or they have enough support, they basically transform the constitution and change the electoral law so that the party is permanently, or the politicians are permanently favored and basically can always win elections. And if that's bad enough, what they also do is to attack the informal norms of democracy. They shatter all kinds of democratic norms, such as the acceptance of the opposition, the idea that in a democracy, you have to tolerate the opposition and you have to tolerate its criticism. Those basic norms go out the window, and the opposition is now called a bunch of traitors, and any kind of criticism is seen as basically insulting the country itself. They violate norms about not using violence, right? One of the norms is, even though they're not very likely to use violence themselves, they will tolerate violence used by their supporters against their opponents and not criticize it the way that a democratic politician would. And above all, they kind of undermine the shared truths that make a democracy work. That elections have integrity, that political institutions are worth it, that taxation is something that, whether we like it or not, is legitimate, and so on. And if we, for example, look at what's been happening in the United States, we can see that, to compare sort of the previous and the current Trump regime, we see this kind of erosion of norms. In 2016, in the first Trump term, we see all of the erosion of informal institutions, a shift in the kind of language that's being used by our president about his opponents, about other countries, about immigrants, and so on. There's a lot of intolerance and a lot of false charges made against individuals and institutions that are not blameworthy. In the second Trump term, what we see instead is a shift to a kind of a blitzkrieg, and I use that word advisedly, attack on the formal institutions. And here, of course, and this is the big question that we'll find out in the next few weeks, is whether the court decisions that go against this kind of blitzkrieg that Elon Musk and President Trump have been implementing, whether if courts decide against this, whether those decisions are obeyed. That, in many ways, is the threshold. If those decisions aren't obeyed, if the Supreme Court, for example, says that you cannot fire government workers and you have to continue to fund government agencies, and if the Trump administration doesn't obey that, that's how we know we've tipped into a different world. We're no longer in a functional democracy. And so far, what this blitzkrieg has taken the form of is a dismantling of federal government institutions, ranging from USAID to the Office of Budget Management, the General Services Association, Administration, but also the FBI, and now apparently the IRS. We see attacks on science, education, and health policy in much the same ways that we see other populists do this further abroad. There's misinformation and media control. There's sort of, attempts to basically make the media bend the knee by not allowing, for example, media representatives, if they represent organizations that don't call the Gulf of Mexico the Gulf of America, and so on. And a highly destabilizing foreign policy, where the United States is now pulling out of sort of agreements that it made and promises that it was supposed to keep for the foreseeable future. That is not something that democracies do. If a democracy agrees to, for example, enter into an alliance, it doesn't pull out without a sort of a lengthy process that involves its own citizens and its representatives. It doesn't just do that by fiat. And what's worrying, some might think, well, these are just, what's the big deal, right? Other administrations have tried to slim down the government. Other administrations have changed foreign policy. But it's pretty clear that a lot of this is politically motivated. So this, for example, is from my colleague, Adam Bonica in the Department of Political Science, where he identifies that what we see here, basically, is an attack on institutions and government organizations that are perceived as being on the left, right? So things like the Department of Education, the National Science Foundation, the Indian Health Service, the Environmental Protection Agency, and others. And the idea is that these are being targeted because they're seen as potential hotbeds of disloyalty and disobedience to the president's goals. The one sort of, exception here is the National Nuclear Security Administration, where a whole bunch of people who are in charge of our nuclear arsenal and its safety were fired. And then, since that was a mistake, there are all kinds of hurried phone calls trying to rehire the same people that just got fired. But be that as it may, the overwhelming pattern is that institutions that are perceived as disloyal to President Trump or potentially sort of disloyal to him were the ones who were being targeted. And perhaps the most corrosive aspect of this, and this was something that has already been done 4 years ago, was to kind of undermine the most fundamental democratic institutions of all in the United States and elsewhere. And that is calling into question electoral integrity. And this has happened in other places like Algeria, Brazil, Georgia, and others. But what made the situation unique was that President Trump claimed in both 2016 and in 2020 that the elections weren't fair, that he was in fact, the votes weren't counted, and that he was in fact an even bigger winner than we thought he was. And the problem here is that the United States elections are the most secure in the world. There's no place else where elections are as secure as in the United States. Yet no place else has anyone sort of sown so much doubt about their integrity as President Trump did in both 2016 and 2020. And there, he claimed that in 2016, there were 3 million illegal votes, which of course also represents his margin of defeat in the popular vote with Hillary Clinton. And then he claimed that there was a big steal in 2020, a sort of a coordinated effort to undermine his electoral victory and to hand it to President Joe Biden. But the actual incidence of electoral fraud in the United States, and if there's one thing that you remember from this talk, I really hope you remember this thing, it's that the actual incidence, and this is as collected by the very conservative Heritage Foundation, who's the author of Project 2025, and cannot under any circumstances be seen to somehow be opposed to President Trump. That foundation collected roughly 1,500 incidents of vote fraud beginning in the 1970s, right? So basically over the last close to 50 years of American elections. That's 1,500 of these cases against billions and billions and billions of votes cast in federal elections. And I actually calculated this. And this basically means that American elections are 99.999998% safe. That's a record that people would, in any other situation, would be very proud of. And yet over 26% of Americans and over 70% of Republicans believed after 2020 that the election was stolen from now President Trump. And this was in many ways impervious to data. And ironically enough, the same protesters who here thought that President Biden failed to win the election and that he was stealing it instead, the same people did not protest when Republican senators, congressional representatives, or governors were elected in the same states that failed to go to Trump. Now, the worry here is that given that we see this all over the place, that there might be some kind of an autocratic coordination, right? That basically autocrats are learning from each other, these illiberal populists are emulating each other, and in effect, what we have is an illiberal international, right? So an international association of these politicians. The worry, of course, is that this is exemplified, but not limited to Vladimir Putin, a leader who basically views democracy with both avarice and disdain. And Putin himself is profoundly anti-democratic. He is very much anti the European Union. He wants to destabilize democracies in Europe and the United States. He really thinks in terms of the near abroad. There's a reason why the Baltics are nervous, precisely because he views them as basically his rightful territory. And so it's really deeply worrying that President Trump has basically lifted sanctions and is now engaging in a very friendly relationship with someone who genuinely believes that basically this is what Europe, for example, looks like. My personal favorite is the European Union itself, the Union of Incestual Homosexuals, which sounds made up, but that's in fact what he called the EU. Yes, I know, that was my reaction as well, exactly. And of course, his efforts have been widely documented. There's his propaganda efforts with Russia, Sputnik, Twitter, and Facebook. There are all kinds of infrastructure attacks, hacking, this sort of unleashing of bots and denial of service attacks, massive misinformation campaigns. He's financed all kinds of allies in France, Italy, and Germany. There are partisan agreements. And of course, there are the invasions of Ukraine and Georgia as countries that basically sort of failed to recognize his sphere of influence. And Putin's support is definitely the source of one sort of the financial well-being of various European populists. This is kind of another rogues gallery of Marine Le Pen. There's Geert Wilders. There's Matteo Salvini. Marine Le Pen of France most notably got a $9 million loan for her electoral campaign, which she never had to pay back. And $9 million might seem laughable in the sort of US market, but this represented something like a third of the total spending on campaigns in France at the time of this election. Some of these politicians have a very sort of open sort of admiration of Putin. Here's Matteo Salvini sitting like any good Italian politician with his cigarettes in the European Parliament, wearing a T-shirt that has Putin's face on it, right? This is in the European Parliament. He's supposed to be representing the people of Italy, not Russia. And of course, most recently, we have Prime Minister Viktor Orbán of Hungary hosting the Conservative Political Action Conference in Budapest, and then visiting Texas for another of these conferences in August. Not surprisingly, leading some analysts to conclude that the American Republican Party is taking its cues from Orbán and his deterioration of democracy. But what I would argue is that despite this kind of appearance of international financing and support, the real call is coming from inside the house. And that's because a lot of this international diffusion is actually quite limited. When it comes to misinformation, there are plenty of international efforts, especially those by Russia, China, and Iran. But it turns out, and this is some of the data from Kate Starbird, is that these things don't take off unless they're amplified by domestic audiences. And so the real misinformation, these things are planted, but the misinformation is very much a domestic phenomenon. There are also reasons to think that this kind of international influence is limited by recent failures, such as China's with COVID policy. There's also a lot of backlash against the invasion of Ukraine. On both the left and the right, there's a new wariness about what the threat that Putin represents towards democracy in Europe. And that's part of the reason why these recent overtures to Russia have been so upsetting. And this kind of attitude manifests itself in personal ways as well, right? This is our friend, Matteo Salvini. And this is the same politician who, after the invasion of Ukraine, goes to a Polish border town that basically is inundated with Ukrainian refugees in order to score political capital and basically see the refugees. And the local mayor says, that's fine, but if you want to go there to see the Ukrainian refugees, put on that T-shirt that you wore in the European Parliament. And to explain to the refugees how it is that you could support the same man that's responsible for their situation. So there are all kinds of ways in which this international diffusion is actually quite limited. Domestically, what limits the damage are basically three different sets of actors. There's those same domestic institutions that are being attacked by the populists. There's civil society, i.e. us. And there's the competence of some of these populists themselves. So when it comes to institutions, there are all kinds of formal institutions that offer resistance and limit the absorption of the populist erosion of democracy. The most important of these, as I already mentioned, are courts. And we'll see whether these hold in the United States or not. But there's also federalism and a kind of institutional inertia that makes it harder in some cases to change institutions and erode democracy. So in the United States, and this also holds for places like India and others, federalism plays a really important role. In Brandeis's famous words, states are the laboratories of democracy. You can have a patchwork of policies across the United States, with some states adopting red and some states adopting blue policies. And that kind of relative autonomy means that it's very hard to impose kind of a uniform erosion of democracy across the board. In an earlier time period, after World War II, what we saw basically was the South that largely functioned as kind of an authoritarian enclave within the United States, where the Democratic Party basically ran pretty much a tyranny. And that was able to succeed precisely because of the relative autonomy of the states from each other. So the result here is that no matter what the sort of national efforts to erode democracy, we're unlikely to see it across the board. Even, for example, the recent Dobbs decision, right? This was not a uniform result of sort of, eliminating abortion across the United States. Instead, it's only in some states where you basically have state legislatures and state constitutions that then enact the abortion ban. There's also a lot of institutional inertia in the United States. The presidential system and the separation of powers have functioned in the past to limit the damage done. This is very much unlike sort of the unitary parliamentary governments in Europe and elsewhere, where there is no separate executive, and the executive and the legislative branches are fused. In the United States, they're separated. And that's part of the reason why the reason why a lot of analysts are now worried is because in the United States, we don't see the legislative branch standing up to the executive. And instead, it's basically conceding all kinds of authority to the executive branch instead of standing up for its own powers. And there's also a lot of institutional inertia. And, if you guys recall from high school civics lessons, in the United States, you have to have 2/3 of both of the houses, or a call of convention, and then 2/3 of the state legislatures. It's a really onerous process to change the Constitution. In some other countries, such as Orbán's Hungary, all it takes is a supermajority. All you need is 2/3 of the vote, and you can write whatever constitution you want. So that kind of inertia also might prevent some of the more egregious erosion of democracy. Secondly, there is civil society. And civil society doesn't directly influence policy, right? You can write all the letters you want, and that's not going to change necessarily policy directly. But what it does is to act as a powerful signal to would-be dissenters. The reason why protests like this always grab the news and why people pay attention to them is not only because they're an attempt to sort of signal people's grievance and sort of what they're protesting, but it's also a way of signaling to other protesters, to other people who are opposed to the regime or to a given policy, that they are not alone. And that's one of the major reasons in which protest is so important. Protest also mobilizes new cohorts, right? And so as people come of age, they basically get mobilized into sort of a new set of political stances. One of the striking things is that the frosh at Stanford today were 10 during the first Trump presidency, right? They basically grew up under Trump. And so they were socialized, and I'm sure some of you are frosh, you were socialized into this kind of a regime that for other people is totally new. And this is why civil society is so important, to act sort of as a reminder that this is not how things always have to be. Civil society also offers all kinds of information and coordination around sort of shared political stances. But perhaps the most convincing way in which civil society can stop the erosion of democracy is the so-called 3.5% rule. And this is based on a lot of research by an academic named Erica Chenoweth, who basically has found that in any society, if over 3.5% of the population are out in the streets protesting against a given regime or a given policy, that regime or policy simply won't stand. So there's something, we're not quite sure what the mechanism is, but there's some magical number around 3.5%. Once that threshold is crossed, it's very hard for an incumbent regime to continue politics as before. And finally, there's also elite competence and elite coordination. The way that it can take place in a positive way is through elite coordination. So for example, in France, this summer, there was a snap election that was held. And in the first round, Marine Le Pen did really, really well. And so everybody was very worried that she basically would run away with the election. And so all the other parties got together and coordinated. They dropped out in specific districts. They announced that they would never work with her. And the result was that when the second round of elections was held, she basically came in a very distant second. And instead, a leftist movement called the New Popular Front won the elections. This can also work in other ways. If elite coordination can help to protect democracy, elite incompetence can also undermine autocratic regimes. So Poland, for example, the crown on the head is entirely a coincidence. This was not, in any way. This is Jarosław Kaczyński, the leader of the autocratic peace party in Poland. And there, you basically have a committed autocrat. He's every bit as committed as Orbán was in Hungary. But they just weren't very competent. So they would send the wrong version of the bill to the Congress and then kind of have to crawl it back. They would send different versions of the bills to the Senate and the Congress. They kept making mistakes, spelling and otherwise. It was not exactly a competent, coordinated kind of a dictatorship. And so they were basically unable to execute many of their plans. They simply just weren't effective enough. And so as a result, in Poland in October 23, after several years of peace rule, the opposition won. Peace won the plurality, but lost the election. There was a huge, massive turnout. Civil society really mobilized and got people out to vote. And you had an opposition victory. And here's the news of Prime Minister Donald Tusk, who's acting obviously very happy. That kind of competence can take other forms. So in Brazil, what we see is an attempt to basically pull another January 6th. The President Bolsonaro lost the election, and he launched what became known as a copycat insurrection. He sent out his supporters to storm the parliament and to storm the Supreme Court. But he chose to do so after the new government was installed, right? Again, not the most effective time to do it. The new government was already in place. It basically had all the power that it needed, and it promptly arrested 500 people, most of the participants in this protest, and made sure that the ringleaders would be removed from power. So that, again, sort of, elite competence can matter a great deal. And in the end, what this all adds up to is that I would argue that democracy is threatened across the world. But the key problems are domestic, not international. We can't blame Putin for what's happening in the United States right now. But that, sort of on a note of some optimism, that institutions, protest, and capable elites can limit the damage. Thank you.
And now we'll open up to questions. If you have a question, just throw your hand up, tell us your name and where you're from, and ask away.
Go ahead.
Yeah, my name is Ramon. I'm a sophomore. And I guess I previously worked for USAID and now work for the World Health Organization until Elon fired me from USAID. So I guess I've seen firsthand some of the issues that you've been seeing, especially in the US not following through on its commitments, especially to civil society, and destabilizing, especially ones related to sexual and reproductive health care. So I guess my question is kind of on the influence of populists on civil society organizations to limit their effectiveness. Here in the US, we've seen the Human Rights Campaign and other LGBTQ groups destabilize. HRC fired 20% of their staff, often because of the big corporations not necessarily following through. 3 days ago, the billionaires on Human Rights Watch's board fired their executive director, unfortunately. So I guess how do you think that populists are collaborating with, billionaires or large companies and other elites to, undermine the power of civil society to kind of serve as that counter, I guess?
Right. So I would say two things about that. I think what we're seeing a lot of, and not just when we're talking about billionaires and wealthy corporations, we're seeing a lot of sort of anticipatory obedience, of sort of anticipating what the new regime would want and acting accordingly, even though the regime hasn't yet demanded of that. And then that's something that we see all over the world. I think what makes the United States unique is that what we're not seeing yet is a full-out onslaught on civil society. So, you can still organize, you can still hold protests, you can still have non-governmental organizations. Whereas in other places, like Russia or Hungary, non-governmental organizations are forced to register as foreign agents. They're subject to sort of, really punitive taxation and to tax raids. They have their leaders arrested. They have some very stringent registration requirements where you have to have 5,000 signatures in every town where you're located in order to function. So we're not seeing any of that yet. So I think at least in the United States for now, there's very limited impact on civil society. There is this kind of anticipatory obedience that you're talking about, but there hasn't been the same kind of onslaught that we've seen in other places. We can still protest if we want. Go ahead.
Why does Orbán keep winning?
Well, so in the first election, actually the first two elections, he didn't get the majority, but there's a highly disproportional electoral system. So he got something like 40% of the votes, but 67% of the seats. As soon as he got that, he basically put in an entirely new constitution with the supermajority and skewed the electoral laws the campaign financing laws, the registration laws, et cetera, in ways that guaranteed him that incumbency. So he wins usually roughly 45% or so of the vote. He gets plenty of support from people that he pays off and that who benefit from his largesse. But for the most part, at this stage, it's really the fact that he skewed the playing field to such an extent that it's very difficult for the opposition to win the majority. So it's a classic pattern where these guys enter through elections, free and fair elections, and then sort of chip away at all the electoral institutions as much as they can to guarantee themselves an incumbency.
I guess my question is more like, why do 45% of people still
Sure.
support him? That seems like a pretty durable illiberal plurality.
Right. So in his particular case, it's because there's an enormous amount of money flowing from the EU, and he directs it to his supporters. Right? So there's an extensive documentation of the kind of social policy and welfare state policies that he has, where basically he's targeting a lot of money to his supporters who know that this is where the gravy train is, and if they don't vote for him, if he's not in power, they won't get the goodies. It's buying off your voters. Okay, there's a question back there.
So I know most people in this room would probably consider democracy an important value, but in the 2024 election here, I was wondering why you thought the Trump is dangerous to democracy argument didn't really resonate with a lot of people.
Well, I think so I think there's two simple answers, right? One is that he was in office once before, and American democracy survived. So how credible is it to talk about our democracy is threatened, et cetera, et cetera? People just didn't buy that because they already had one term of Trump, and their evaluation was baked in. Democracy survived; it was absolutely fine. So I think that's one reason why that message didn't work. The second reason is that what people really cared about, and this is what every single public opinion poll showed, the two top issues were inflation and immigration, not the state of our democracy. And people felt that President Trump would do a better job of addressing both of those. Yep. So you had your hand up for a long time.
So most of the examples that you discussed are, I guess, what you could call sort of right-wing populists.
Mm-hmm.
However, I have in recent years sort of also seen the term left-wing populist thrown around to describe people like Bernie Sanders, for example.
Mm-hmm.
So first of all, my question would be, do you think the characterization of someone as a left-wing populist, do you think that even holds? And then, okay, so if it doesn't hold, well then, is populism really just an intrinsically right-wing thing? And if it does hold, what do you think kind of are the differences between someone who's characterized as a right-wing versus a left-wing populist?
Sure. So they're very much left-wing populists. We see them, so AMLO in Mexico, Chavez in Venezuela are classic examples of left-wing populists. What characterizes them and what differentiates them from right-wing populists is that they sort of, they define the nation much more broadly, right? So rather than sort of, the kind of Christian nationalism or sort of nativism that you see with, or welfare chauvinism that you see with right-wing populists, they basically will sort of, incorporate all kinds of groups that weren't sort of part of politics before. Chavez, when he comes to power, empowers a lot of very poor people to become much more politically and economically active. But what they where they don't differ from right-wing populists at all is the fact that both left-wing and right-wing populists show a total disregard for the formal institutions of democracy and democratic norms. So both Chavez and AMLO have undermined democracy in their respective countries, but from the left, right? So there's no difference in that kind of propensity to erode democracy once in office. Yeah, go ahead.
Hi, Laura. I'm a junior. I wanted to ask about if and to what extent populism is eroding the international liberal order in terms of different international organizations such as the UN and NATO, with the rise of populist and authoritarian leaders.
Yeah, so it's not eroding the UN as much, largely because there are all kinds of autocratic regimes who are always part of the UN and no one seems to mind. The institution continues to function. But when it comes to NATO, for example, it has been undermined quite severely. And there is the United States basically pulling out of its NATO commitments, but there are also actors within NATO, like Turkey or Hungary, that are basically autocratic and who have close connections to Russia and who make it very there's been a lot of worry about sharing of intelligence and sharing of sort of military coordination with potential enemies of democracies. So it's definitely taken a toll on all kinds of international organizations, not just I guess the UN's not a good example, but it's taken a toll on all kinds of international organizations. Yep.
Hi, my name is Lalo. I was actually gonna ask earlier about like your opinion on like why you were considering AMLO as like a populist, because I feel like based on like the presentation, like some like parts of a populist politician is like also like attacking educational institutions and like some government institutions. However, I felt like that was not really the case with AMLO during his tenure. And also, I guess, like, he kind of, like, differs a little bit in the way, like, he trying to stay in power. After, like, his first, like, term, he was just like, okay, I'm done, I'm gone. But then, I also curious about your own opinion now that Claudia, who is, like, also from his party, and, like, I guess, kind of, like, somehow his pupil, because he kind of, like, grew her up in politics. Like, what is your opinion on that? This could we, like, take it as, like, a way for him to like try to just keep the track of like his ideals in the Mexican government.
Mm-hmm. So, you know, I think to me AMLO is a classic left populist, partly because he comes to power on sort of a critique of previous elites as being very corrupt, right? And he, of course, very conveniently comes to power after Enrique Peña Nieto, who was incredibly corrupt, right? But the point is that, you know, he has this criticism of sort of, you know, the establishment as being incredibly corrupt, as not serving Mexico, and he repeatedly claims to be a better representative of all Mexicans than any of the previous politicians. Those are classic populist claims, right? He's not on the right because he actually sort of, you know, continues with redistribution. He's not necessarily sort of, you know, serving business or anything like that. But then he starts to erode democracy in much the same ways. And I think, you know, the two sort of, you know, the big sort of thresholds were one, when he goes after the courts, and secondly, when he went after the Electoral Commission, right? The undermining of the independence of the Electoral Commission, whom he blamed for earlier defeats, was, you know, clearly a step too far. That's what basically sort of, you know, it tips him over into sort of a you know, destruction of democracy or the erosion of democracy outright. So he's very much, you know, he's not necessarily on the right wing. He's a leftist populist. He's very corrosive. It's really interesting to see what's going to happen with Claudia Sheinbaum, right? Because President Sheinbaum is, on one hand, very much his protege. On the other hand, she's repeatedly tried to carve out sort of, you know, a separate political sphere for herself. So, you know, time will tell, right? If she goes, you know, if she starts to attack the institutions in much the same way that he does, then she too will be sort of, you know, a corrosive force when it comes to Mexican democracy. Go ahead.
Thank you for your presentation. My name is Turner and I'm a freshman. I'm curious.
Yay, Frosh.
I'm curious about one of the charts you showed about these nascent post-communist democracies.
Yeah.
Do you foresee there are any structural elements besides previous exposure to authoritarianism that make them particularly susceptible to populism?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. So it's what's really happening is that, you know, the transition after communism wasn't just sort of, you know, we now have democracy and there's sort of more political freedom. It was also a massive, massive economic transformation. And there were a ton of people who really lost out, right? They were sort of, you know, the ones who didn't benefit from the free market, who didn't benefit from, you know, labor competition and so on. And because they were left behind, they're deeply resentful of what this new system meant. And so that's really sort of, you know, the main pool of voters that the populists get. And that pool of voters isn't available to West European politicians because there, after World War II, you basically have an economic success story for a long time and a very sort of stable system of social policy, of sort of, you know, compensatory mechanisms, of protecting labor and so on. But in these sort of new democracies after the Cold War ends, in the post-communist countries, those protections are very wobbly and the economic shock is so huge that a lot of people basically say, you know, this is democracy, I want no part of it. Yeah. Go ahead.
Hi, thank you for the presentation. I wanted to ask about the push-pull and the dynamics between populism's rise and that of the resistance.
Mm-hmm.
So it seems as though the weathering of democracy is much easier to impose compared to building it up.
Mm-hmm.
And so with populism and its ability to chip away at existing institutions, change the rules of the game, etc., do you see that there might be a turning point at which populism's rise is not able to be countered significantly by a concomitant rise in the resistance? Or do they sort of play off of each other in such a way that the resistance can be seen as effective even if populism continues to strengthen in the future?
So I think, at a certain point, two things happen, right? One is that if the populist in power is powerful enough, civil society no longer has the capacity to oppose, right? You're basically, people are too scared to do it. They're worried about losing their jobs. They're worried about going out into the street because we're no longer functioning in a democracy with freedom of association. So that's one pathway. The other pathway is that once democracy is eroded enough, even if civil society is successful in overturning that regime, that doesn't necessarily mean a return to democracy. It kind of it basically represents a return to ground zero, where you now have to build up democratic institutions from the bottom up. And so either way, right, civil society has a really tough job ahead of it, because on one hand, it could just be sort of cowed into submission. And on the other hand, even if it's successful, it has this enormous job ahead of it, because as you point out, it's so much easier to sort of erode democracy than it is to build it up again and stabilize it. Not to be pessimistic or anything. Okay. Go ahead.
I have a question and maybe seeking some practical advice from us about protests and how they're perceived. I think when thinking about institutions like universities, they'll very often sort of celebrate a history of student protest and student dissent, and yet we've seen in the last year that in the moment when it's happening, they are condemned. So I guess I was wondering if there's a better alternative to protest, other ways to, I guess, work against populism, or if you feel like maybe civil society as a whole is also being eroded by populism.
So when it comes to protests, I think there are sort of several lessons from protests elsewhere that seem to sort of ranging from the sort of purely tactical to sort of the more high concept. The first is it's just very simple. Sit-ins don't work, marches do, right? Because those basically get media attention, and if you're marching, that gets the attention of media and other people much more than if you're sitting on campus. The second one is to build a broad coalition, right? So not just students, but professors, community members, as broad a coalition as you can build that join you on that march. And that's both because there's strength in numbers, and because it's much easier to sort of pick off a narrow group of people, oh, it's just those crazy students again, as opposed to a much bigger group of people from across classes, racial groups, et cetera, et cetera. And third of all, and this is I think the most important part, it is very important that the protests remain entirely peaceful and speak, and this is hard, but they speak in a civil language, right? Once you start calling people names, once you start threatening violence, support for those protests just drops out. There's a fantastic article by Omawaso about sort of the civil rights protests in the United States in the 60s. And they worked when they were large and peaceful. That's what basically, and that's because the media would then sort of report on them and report on these peaceful protests and their goals, and it made the protesters and their goals so much more accessible, right? People would say, well, this is totally reasonable. Why is Bull O'Connor attacking civil rights protesters when all they're doing is asking for equal rights? So there's I think those three things are really important to sort of get out there in the streets, to have a very broad coalition, and above all, to be sort of peaceful and civil. Because there's no faster way of losing political capital than if you basically, spray paint or call people names or do things that are seen as destructive or uncivil. Sure. Okay, I think we're in the second round of questions. Okay, go ahead.
I'm going to break an unwritten rule and ask a political scientist a normative question.
Oh, God.
There's been a lot of talk in the U.S. about how in the next election we need to match right-wing populism with left-wing populism, and how that's the only way to get the star power to win in a social media-ified age. Mm-hmm. Is that something that you can accept as, if not the optimal response, a better response than remaining on this classical liberalism track? Right.
So I think if you want to stick with liberal democracy, you have to be committed to liberal democratic norms of rule of law, majority rule, minority rights, freedoms of association, et cetera, et cetera. I don't think those are negotiable if we want to maintain our democracy. What I would say is where I think if the Democratic Party wants to do something, it can actually address the needs of workers and the needs of people who have moved over to the Trump camp, right? And instead, what we see for a very long time in the 1990s and afterwards is a Democratic Party that seems to have abandoned labor and abandoned sort of core supporters for offering 50,000 little policy proposals for 50,000 different groups, right? The infamous example of this was Hillary Clinton, who on her campaign website had 40 different proposals for 40 groups defined not by interest, but by background, right? So she had one set of proposals for for Black Americans, another set of proposals for gay Americans, another set of proposals for women, none of which added up to sort of a coherent set of appeals to Americans. So, I think if the left wants to do something, it should definitely not abandon liberal democracy, but it should actually speak to the voters and to meet them where they are, rather than sort of, either talking about the threats to democracy that voters aren't buying into, or by ignoring real issues like inflation, immigration, and others that they do care about. Yes, go ahead.
I have sort of like a strange question, I guess, but since populism is a lot about institutions, how important is it how you define institutions? I read a piece previously by Beatrice Magaloni, and she sort of argues that like gangs can function maybe as a state control of violence and thus be an institution. Say that like a politician is getting rid of that. Would that count as like destroying institutions, or maybe not?
So institutions are really the rules of the game. That's all they are, right? And they could be enforced by the state, then they're formal. It could be enforced by ostracism and the community, in which case they're informal. But all that institutions are is sort of rules for doing something, whether it's resolving conflict or anything like that. I think the gangs that Beatrice talks about are a way of keeping local law and order. They're very much institutions, but they're not democratic institutions, right? And the concern isn't that we have gangs as a way of keeping order, we have the state as a way of keeping order. The concern is, what is the set of democratic institutions that underpin a functional democracy? And those are things like elections, courts, the rule of law, and so on. And those are the institutions that if you care about democracy, you want to protect. The others are still important rules, but they're not as critical to democracy.
Thank you.
Chris. All right. Yeah.
This isn't that deep of a question, but I'm just curious since you mentioned autocratic coordination. What are your thoughts on Trump's recent comments about Zelensky being a dictator because he doesn't hold elections, obviously because of the Martial law?
Yeah.
But why is he giving those comments, and what does that mean?
Well, I think he clearly thinks that, so there are several things to be said about this. One is that those are exactly Putin's talking points. President Trump, for whatever reason, has been faithfully following Putin's talking points about how Ukraine brought this upon itself, how it's corrupt, how Zelensky hasn't held elections, et cetera, et cetera. Secondly, it's rather ironic, given that the leaders he considers his closest allies, Putin or North Korea, et cetera, simply don't hold elections at all, or Putin holds elections that are totally fraudulent. So there's a deep irony here. As to why he's doing it, their theories range from it's the last thing he heard to sort of a transactional understanding of politics, and this is where he wants to basically have investments, and he was promised Nord Stream, all the way to sort of a sincere belief in sort of big power politics, where whoever is the big power is automatically right because they've become the big power. So there's a variety of explanation for why he's doing it. I'm not sure why he's doing it, but it is clear, it is entirely consistent with what Putin has been saying, and it totally ignores the lack of elections by his closest allies. Yeah, I think we have time for one. Yeah.
Yeah, I guess on your slide I guess had photos of populists, and one of them was Benjamin Netanyahu.
Mm-hmm.
I guess to some extent, I feel like a lot of the norms or institutions that he undermined were not necessarily, domestic, or depending on how you define domestic, like destroying Al Jazeera, or undermining the UN, UNRWA, etc. So what are your, why did you, deem him like a populist? And how does, undermining international institutions kind of engage with that,
So he's a populist because, again, he made those claims about corrupt elites and representing all Israelis, right, as the people, as a Jewish people. He was very narrow in understanding of who Israeli citizens are. The reason why he's so corrosive to democracy is because he attacks fundamental institutions of Israeli democracy. So he goes after the Supreme Court and tries to limit its ability to basically review laws and hold them accountable for his corruption and his violation of human rights. And that in many ways is, that's the reason why we saw those huge protests, week after week after week, because people, view the Supreme Court as this fundamental constraint on what he can do. So in that case, he's eroding democracy. When it comes to sort of international relations, I think the big sort of violation of democratic norms comes when leaders, populist or otherwise, basically violate various treaties and international agreements that had been agreed upon by their people as sort of, represented in Congress or in the parliament. And that's exactly what he was doing. There were all kinds of agreements that the Israeli parliament had agreed to, and he was violating them. So in that case, that was a profoundly anti-democratic action in the international arena. All right. Well, in that case, thank you so much for the wonderful questions. Have some boba, and enjoy your evening. Thank you.